Hi, Roddy. Nice to talk to you.
And to you, Emma. I had my novel, my new novel, Love, was supposed to come out here in May. And quite wisely, but disappointingly, the publishers pushed it back to October. So it isn't out here yet. You, on the other hand, from what I've read, your book was supposed to be out next year.
Next spring. That's right. But when I delivered it and my publishers pointed out a connection that I really hadn't seen, they said maybe we should bring it out fast. And you know the way you always think, Roddy Doyle, that it takes about a year to make a book, because that's what they usually tell us. But apparently they can really get a book out in a few months if they want to.
But it must be a bit like, putting the baby to bed and coming in later to check it out. And it's a teenager.
Also, I thought I'd have a nice, long, peaceful time of a year. But on the other hand, I was a little bit worried that people would be so thoroughly sick of anything pandemic related by next year that they'd just be repulsed by it. So as soon as the publishers in April said, listen, what about July? I said, fine, better this year than next year, I suppose. But it is very curious because the book is being read really entirely in terms of its relationship with COVID, which was not there in the writing, Not that I mind.
Yeah, because it's inevitable. You must. It's a bit like these days when I'm watching something on TV and there's a very crowded room full of people who are sweating and rubbing shoulders, and you're thinking, Christ.
It's like a Roman orgy, isn't it?
For nobody,
Or even themselves. I watched the series, the second season of Big Little Lies, and Nicole Kidman was constantly fondling her own face. And it was in those early weeks in March when we were all emphasizing not touching our own faces rather than thinking about other people's vaporous breath. So I just kept thinking, put your hands down, Nicole.
Yeah. But I found because inevitably there's at least a year between finishing the book and delivering it and publication. And I've always thought it's actually psychologically wise, that you can kind of, in a way, consign it to the past and get on working with something else. But you're thrown right into the middle of it. I don't want to sound as if this is some terrible hardship you've had to endure, because, I'm quite envious of you, really.
It got the book tons of attention, so I'm not complaining at all. But I agree that usually, there's some distance there. So you haven't just freshly written it at the point where it's being judged. There's a little gap. But I agree, this time it all happened a bit fast. But this whole year is so weird. Publishing a book is the least of it. When I look back in this year, I won't be thinking, oh, how fast my book got published. I'll be thinking, remember, we were afraid to touch our own faces. Remember, we were, couldn't go see our loved ones. What a strange year. And actually, I quite like having a novel out that's about healthcare workers at the moment. I never thought the focus would be on that, but being able to talk about nurses and doctors and midwives and hospital orderlies and hospital cleaners and volunteers, they are looming really large at the moment as figures in a way they don't usually.
As they do in your book.
Indeed.
Unbelievable. I read it very, very quickly, and I suspect you're going to hear that a lot, because it's such an intense experience that it defies, you're lying in bed half asleep, but, the notion of, putting this aside to read it again 24 hours later just seems so absurd, really, because it's so intense. The story is so gripping. But I suppose the question is an obvious one. I mean, when the pandemic started, now I went out of my way to find Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague here just to read it,
As you would, yes. We'd expect nothing less of you.
Hamnet, Maggie O'Farrell's novel, which I thought was brilliant. But there was the bloody plague. And I didn't know the plague was going to be in it. And there it was, and again, I don't know, maybe 5 times over the last 4 months, I've picked up something, a bit at random. And there it is, the pandemic or the plague or some sort of reference to viral infection. So what I'm wondering, where did the spark come from? If it isn't current affairs, where did you think? Because I wrote a novel, A Star Called Henry, 20 years ago. It came out 20 years ago. And I did a lot of research around that period, from about 1916 up to 1923 or so. And I don't remember there being an awful lot about the pandemic or the Spanish flu, as it came to be called.
You're right. It's been weirdly overshadowed by the war. If it had happened on its own, everyone would remember it. but it was just one more horror at the very end of the war. You know, I have to thank you, Roddy. A Star Called Henry was crucial for this book because, like many Southerner, you know, a person growing up in the Republic of Ireland in the 70s, I was utterly turned off the national question. It just struck me as either boring or associated with the IRA kneecapping people. So I was just, you know, averted from that whole tradition. I paid no attention to it. And so I thought history was boring because I thought history was mostly endless fighting over the green and the orange, you know. And your Star Called Henry was the first book that made me realize there might have been bigger issues at stake in 1916, that it might have been about things like poverty and justice. And I would say similarly, Ken Loach's film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, again, that one sort of caught the kind of utopian excitement of let's make a new Ireland rather than just who's going to be the boss. So those two were crucial for me.
Brilliant. And where recently then? Where did you find, what did you see or hear or read?
I'm embarrassed to admit this because it sounds terribly dry. It was an article in The Economist. I was stuck on a train. I'd left my computer at home by mistake charging. So I was on a train with nothing but a copy of The Economist. I was thinking, okay, I suppose I'll read every word of it. And then
you might see it.
Exactly. They had an article about the centenary of the 1918 flu pandemic. So this was October 1918. I was on my way to the Toronto Festival of Authors. And that article, I don't even know who wrote it because they don't use bylines. It seized my imagination with the spooky atmosphere of that pandemic because it was modern times. You know, they were going to work on the tram. They were turning on electric lights. It was sort of a busy modern world. It wasn't plague times like we might imagine in Shakespearean London. And yet, you know, their society was being like, it was grinding to a halt because of the terror of death. And they were placing their trust in, you know, raw onions and eucalyptus oil and superstitions. So a very modern but broken kind of world. So I thought, you know, I could almost write a novel about the 1918 pandemic and it would have a sort of post-apocalyptic atmosphere rather than a sort of traditional historical novel. And I thought also in that whole time with, you know, a global war going on and a global pandemic, I thought I can only write this if I find one little hook, you know, somewhere to really anchor the story. And so very early on in the research, like about day 2, I think I came across the fact that women in late pregnancy were the ones most likely to catch it and have bad side effects. And I was like, oh, there we are, a maternity ward. That's where I want to place it. Yeah, and you know, that's another reason that people read this book fast, Roddy, because nobody really wants labor to last very long. So it's not really something to linger over and sample. It's more like, get the baby out, get the baby out. There are quite a few births in the novel.
The relay of labours, really, isn't it, in the book? Yeah, it should be an Olympic event, really, shouldn't it?
It's true. And I don't know about you, but early on in writing any book, there's a moment where I can feel a good cohort of my readers leaving. You know, like in Room, the child's voice I know would have turned off people like my dad on about page 2. And with this one, like the first time there was a splash of bodily fluids, I was like, oh, I see them leaving. But you know, you can't woo them back. You have to just make the book be the book it wants to be. You know, you have to follow the book's logic rather than trying to make a compromise between the book you're writing and the book they'd like. So I thought, okay, bodily fluids all the way.
Right. 2 questions. Well, there, 2 questions about location. One in the kind of vaguely macro. Why Dublin? And a stupid question in a way because you're from Dublin, but why Dublin?
I mean, certainly not all my books have been set there. This one, because I was free to set it anywhere, I wasn't wedded to one particular historical incident the way I have been with some of my previous historical books. I thought I'm free to set it anywhere and I could probably get Dublin right in terms of the language and the atmosphere. But also, you know, I did remember enough from my history studies to know that it was quite an interesting time politically in Ireland. And I thought it would be great to have a main character who's a nurse and who's just keeping her head down, trying to absolutely concentrate on her demanding job. But in the background, there are all these bigger political questions and she's really trying to keep them at bay. You know, there's a moment where she says to a doctor, like, oh, I've no time for politics. And the doctor, who is also a revolutionary, Kathleen Lynn, says to her, everything's politics. So in a way, the politics kind of crept into the book. But I suppose by placing the novel in Dublin in the first place, I should have known that politics would creep in because, I mean, that was an astonishing time in terms of how fast people's opinions changed.
Yes.
You know, if you think that, you know, at Easter in 1916, seems to me a lot of the country was appalled and surprised by that 6-day rising. And then 3 years later, Sinn Féin were getting a majority in the election. I mean, that's I can't think of any political opinion that I've ever changed that fast, and these are meant to be faster times.
Yeah. And at the same time, men were coming back from the war to a different country.
Yeah, that's right.
My father's uncle in 1914 joined what he called the army. But when he came back, he survived. And when he came back in 1918, it was immediately apparent that he was no longer in the army. He was in the British Army. The adjective had been added. So much had happened and opinions had changed so much. So the other thing, because I'll get back to the politics and the history in a bit, but the other thing really is it's not a question about location. It's a not particularly original observation about yourself. Room is set in a room. The Wonder, another great book, is set basically in a cottage, isn't it, really?
Yep, in a sick room in a cottage. I agree. It's not locked, but there's a little girl who won't eat, so she's basically confined there.
Yeah, and this one isn't even in a ward. It's basically in a cupboard that's converted into a ward. So your rooms, it seems, are getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
I mean, to be honest,
I think it's brilliant. It works really well, and it really, I suppose, it also keeps you on the straight and narrow in terms of telling the story. But
I don't think I have the skills, Roddy. The kind of novel I'm thinking, like Jane Smiley wrote a really enjoyable novel about the horse trade, and it's roamed over different continents, different aspects of horse racing and horse riding and so on. And wonderful if you can manage the whole orchestra like that. I honestly feel I don't have the skills. I think if I tried to do a novel that sort of skimmed over a global pandemic during a world war, I think the results would have been terribly thin. So I think this is just what I'm good at. And occasionally people will think that I have very murky psychological reasons for this. Why am I trying to perpetually trap myself in a room? And I say, it's a literary choice that makes life easier because, things naturally intensify if you shut the door, But you're one to talk, Roddy. There may be a slight change from a restaurant to a pub to another pub. But basically, Davy and Joe in love are, on one long drinking night,
Yeah.
So you observe the unities of time, space, and action quite often yourself there.
Yeah, this is true. And what I love about the book is that the women, and it's overwhelmingly women, obviously, they're forced into getting to know each other somehow really quickly. They don't have a choice.
There's no privacy. That's right. There's no curtains even.
Oh, no privacy. There isn't even a curtain, is there really? It's fantastic. And there's the what I like as well, what I love about many things I love about the book is that there's the biology at work, which is just glorious in a way and terrifying. It's really terrifying. And the fact of our and their mortalities is so glaring all the time. But then there's also not just the biology but there's also the politics. You manage to do it all. It must be really heavily researched because even though in many ways it's quite familiar because of what we're going through at the moment, it's also, in a lesser writer's hand, we'd have a lot of description as opposed to just a well-placed adjective or noun that does the work. But the labor involved. I mean, you were talking earlier about writing about health workers, but the sheer labor and skill and timing involved is just extraordinary.
I think it was very odd. Nurses in those days, they did a lot of what would be done by other people in the hospital now. Like they were meant to be mixing up beef tea and little egg flips for their patients, so minor cooking and an awful lot of bed changing. And luckily the patients in this novel don't need much food because they're being kept in a perpetual state of befuddlement with hot whiskey, which was just about the only treatment for the flu. Yeah, but they had to do a lot of, getting supplies and changing beds and so on. And they were also meant to know the signs of danger, and they had no authority. They were meant to call in the doctor. So even when you read, like I read several nurses' manuals from the 1910s, but they're very stern on, we're telling you this just so that you know when to get the doctor. You're not meant to actually use any of this information. They weren't meant to use a stethoscope even, no playing with the boys' toys, as it were. So it's an interesting job. I find this is why I've written about nurses twice, because they have a huge level of skill and importance, but they've so little status. So it makes them a good kind of linchpin in the system,
Yeah. But I suppose it's trial and error. I mean, I'm assuming you never worked as a nurse yourself.
Never worked as in anything, Roddy. All my knowledge is theoretical.
Again, this is it's a kind of a reader's question, and just a how did she do it question. Did you get the opportunity to sit in a labour ward at all, other than the time that you're giving birth yourself?
No, I suppose, I prefer curtains in that I wouldn't want any woman to have to put up with having me sitting there, No, I remembered 2 births myself well, and I got a midwife to check through the book once I'd written it.
Yeah.
But no, most of my research is books, and I have Dr. Tweedy of the Rotunda Hospital in Dublin. He did a book in the 1910s with really graphic illustrations of how to cut up mothers and babies in times of crisis, or they'd have chapters headed things like malformations. So mostly books and pictures, and often I would look at modern websites for advice on how you would deal with a particular birth crisis, and then I would ask myself, which of these bits of information did they have in 1918, and which of these either machines or drugs did they have? And usually the answer was none of them. So in a way, I did modern research so that the information would be medically precise, and then I would kind of peel it away, and I'd be left with, they suspected the blood pressure was a bit high, but there was nothing they could do about it. So there was a lot of, watch and wait,
So we have women in labour being given hot whiskey. And there are also references to cocaine and heroin.
The nursing and doctors and nurses were sometimes taking cocaine. Yes, it was sold in Harrods. It was a little kind of pick-me-up kit, And sometimes, for soldiers and for anyone who had a stressful job, like you and me, Roddy Doyle.
Where in Dublin would you have born? Where in Dublin would you have bought your heroin?
Question. I don't know. I know Harrods was a main supplier. Maybe, as with, say, contraceptives and so on, it would be sent over from England,
Right.
I don't know where in Dublin you'd have bought it. Yeah. But yes, they by comparison with today, they had no good medicine. They had no good machines. They didn't even have, you couldn't put someone on a drip even. So they had to be very fatalistic about many of the, the awful shocks that flesh is heir to. And another interesting thing is because babies were so hard to save. In a birth situation, they were all instructed, save the mother. Forget the baby. The baby probably is going to die anyway. The mother, you could get another 10 babies out of her. So just keep preserving her for future children. That was the priority, really.
What was the phrase that the nurse was able to recite? Something about you proving your love for your husband by...
Oh, she doesn't love him unless she gives him 12. Yeah, I made that up as a proverb, but it was trying to capture what I was reading about in oral histories of the Dublin slums. There was a huge emphasis on the Irish mammy and how marvelous she was to keep proving not only that she was a good woman and a good Catholic, but a good wife by giving so many children. That really, if she had fewer children than that, it seemed unenthusiastic. And I mean, I was the youngest of 8, and I found that pretty normal, obviously. But now when I tell people that in Canada, they look at me in horror as if my mother must have been, captive in a cult. So there's been a big generational shift in that, hasn't there? My Irish friends and siblings, they have no more than 2 or 3.
My father doesn't know how many first cousins he had, or didn't know how many he had. He literally did not know.
Yeah.
I used to know how many first cousins I had, but it was somewhere between 30 and 40. My own children have 2.
That's a serious shrinkage, isn't it?
It's a bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember telling somebody in the United States asked, how many children do you have? And I said 3. And she looked at me as if it was some, primitive or something, 3. Whereas 3 would have been a very small family when I was a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, I have a question.
Protestant family, it was called.
That's funny. I have a question apropos of your kids. Don't worry, not a probing one. But I think you said last time I was interviewing you in Toronto in happier times, you said that your children sometimes find it a bit embarrassing, that you are a famous person in Ireland. So one thing I was wondering about is I know you have very strong long-term friendships. You talked about them before. Do your friends ever get a bit embarrassed by you being a public figure as well, or is it easier for them to not feel integrated?
The great thing about being a bald man with glasses in Dublin, a bald white man with glasses, I suppose I have to add the white bit now, Dublin being so cosmopolitan, is that we're not exactly rare. So if I was I'd go to, say, well, before the lockdown, I'd go to a football game in Dalymount Park on a Friday night. And I suppose if I was looking at the other side of the stadium, there'd be, the spotlight, or the it would be on these shining domes. So anonymity has become quite an easy thing in Dublin. And having a surname like Doyle helps as well.
Yeah. Well, that's visual anonymity, though. But if, your friends must have friends who know that you're a friend of theirs. So, when you come out with a book about friends in a pub and their chats and their lives and so on, do your friends ever feel a little bit, as if the spotlight's on them?
Good question. I'll get back to you. I'll ask them. I think ignorance might be bliss. I'd be afraid of the answer.
Yeah.
But, I suppose I haven't. I can only offhand think of one short story, where I actually used an event from beginning to end, where I was one of several people, and old friends in Spain at the time. But I did tell them I was doing this, and what did they think? Was it a good idea? And they all thought, yeah, it was a great idea.
Yeah, I've sometimes asked permission if a friend tells me something distinctive that happened to them. I sometimes say, would you mind if I use that? And they're usually thrilled. But still, I'd want to check, because not everybody feels that way. Some people feel you're stealing their souls. Maybe
ignorance is bliss. Maybe I won't ask you. I won't ask them. I'll just bypass that one, I think. I want to get back to the politics of the book, because I think you do that really, really well as well. Am I right in thinking there's one real person in the book?
Yeah, Dr. Kathleen Lynn is the only real one. I was not looking for a real person at all, because I've quite often written about real historical incidents, and it's great. It's a great sort of stimulus. It's like the bit of grit that starts the pearl growing, But it's a big hassle as well. You're like, oh, it would be much handier now if that happened 5 years later. So when I can write about purely fictional people, obviously it's easier. But I was just researching doctors of the time, and I very quickly came across Kathleen Lynn, and you couldn't make her up.
Yeah.
In that I needed a doctor who'd be brought in as a locum, as a temp. Yeah. So Kathleen Lynn was roving around. She had specialities in ophthalmology, insanity, and midwifery, because no one Irish hospital secured her permanently. It's generally thought that, the men didn't want a female colleague. And she was also literally on the run during the time period of my book, because she was Sinn Féin's chief of health. And, in the big roundup of Sinn Féin members, they hadn't found her. So she was disguising herself routinely so as not to be arrested during this time. So, the combination of her sort of Labour background and her suffragism and her Irish revolutionary politics and her doctoring, and she's such a feel for the poor too. Like, she set up her own little private flu clinic and was trying out vaccines, fairly ill-fated vaccines in 1918. So, she just was this figure who bridged several worlds. And I thought she would have a bit more of a bird's eye view to offer on the whole situation. Yeah. It would be unnatural if my nurse protagonist was saying things like, oh, I hear that the Germans cremate the bodies for greater hygiene. But I thought that's exactly the kind of fact that a well-read doctor might have to share. And then I thought, oh, this gives me a kind of a chain of influence. If I have this busy nurse and this doctor influencing her and kind of waking her up a bit intellectually. And then I also wanted a complete nobody who's the volunteer assistant, Bridie Sweeney. And I thought, that makes the whole thing more interesting if I have these three women at completely different ends of the of the kind of status ladder in a hospital.
Yeah, and Bridie's so lovely. She's just great as a character. But Kathleen Lynn is just such a fascinating. You'd wonder, as with quite a few of those revolutionaries, but I think in a way, and particularly having read your book with her, you'd wonder, where did they get, literally, where did they get the time? Where did she get the time to be both such an expert, a medical expert, and such a practitioner, in a real sense, a practitioner, and a revolutionary at the same time? Like, not only did she deliver babies, she delivered what eventually became the Republic of Ireland.
I suppose it's a matter of ask a busy person,
Yeah. And I love that there's a line in the book where it may be where, after it's 2 days basically, isn't it? Yeah.
3, just about 3 days. Yeah.
I think it's after day 1, which seems like an eternity, and it's so intense that, and the nurse, she leaves the hospital. She's coming down the steps, and she's saying goodbye to Bridie, if I remember right. And she's going to get the tram and then find her bicycle and cycle home and to a well-earned rest. And then Kathleen Lynn asks her to help with an autopsy.
That is a cruel moment, yes. Really, it would be entirely within Julia's rights to say, I have given all I have to give.
There's brilliant. I think it's there where Kathleen Lynn, it's almost perverse, but it's also so true. She says, we'll never learn more than we can now. This is why she wants the autopsy. She wants to learn. And she sees this as an opportunity. It's that curiosity reined in, I suppose, to a bigger purpose. But it was a glorious way to look at it, really, wasn't it?
It's true. And you could see, I suppose, revolutionary politics as a kind of a curiosity. Like, there must be other ways to run the country than this, like, what if we changed it all up? It's not just a restlessness, it's also a kind of open-mindedness, and wrong-minded ideas might come up too, but at least they were trying to open their mind to new ways of doing things. I in her comment about, we'll never learn faster than this, I was trying to capture a weird quality of almost nostalgia that I found in memoirs by nurses and doctors. Somebody like a peer of Dr. Lynn's, Dorothy Stopford Price, her writings about the flu, she sounds slightly, hyped and excited all the time. And Kathleen Lynn's diaries too, and sources from other countries, say America. There was one volunteer, for instance, who, worked in a hospital for 6 days and then died of the flu. And she said, apparently on her deathbed, she said, this was the best week of my life. So, without being sentimental about the sacrifice and all that, I did want to capture what exactly was so thrilling about this experience, that so many women in particular seem to have felt just, kind of called onto a high stage for the first time, really, really important. And maybe you would put up with an absolutely grueling job for that feeling of, I am necessary. And I suppose for women in particular, the right to work hasn't always been taken for granted. And so, I think women quite often would put up with bad working situations because there was the basic thrill of, I'm not at home, I'm somebody, I have a name.
And the nurse, she hits the age of 30 on day 2. And this now is the time when she can vote.
Yeah, they've only just brought it in. They brought in the vote for women. And it's not that they thought younger women were too immature. It's just that they were aware that with so many men dead, if they suddenly let all the women vote, the voting bloc would be more women than men. And they were so horrified at that thought that they were like, slow them down. So they literally filtered the voting population of women by saying they have to be over 30 and have some property. They didn't want poor women at first. So,
and she wouldn't have known, and the characters in the book wouldn't have known. What we know is that she was going to get the opportunity to vote very soon after.
Yeah. You really have to avoid retrospect, don't you, when you're writing novels set in the past? And I didn't want them to be like, oh yes, any day now there'll be an armistice. I think they felt just utterly trapped in it. Like, yes, every now and then a rumor spreads that the Kaiser is going to give up, but we can't trust it until it happens. So just that feeling of being trapped in the moment that, well, frankly, so many of us have had this year. I was really trying to capture that, so to go in tightly in time as well as in space, I suppose, was really important to me. But then love only lasts one night, Roddy, and it feels almost real time. You're in this long conversation between Joe and Davy, and it just winds. And I know it's not actually, real time in terms of, it's a shaped conversation. Of course it's shaped, but it's so naturalistically done, you almost feel like, oh yeah, now he needs to go to the toilet again. It feels absolutely real in your body how long this conversation is. And
in the first draft and the second draft, I took about 5 pints back off them, So that would be about their age, about 4 trips to the toilet, I'd say.
So you mean, did they get drunker in the first one, in the first draft?
It was an endless night. I always write way too much in the first draft anyway, but my agent, who's a great reader, Lucy Luck, she wondered about the amount that they were drinking. So I went back and very carefully, that it's well within the bounds. Maybe
So you were like the barman saying, now lads, slow down, slow down. And my son took an online safety course about how to serve food and drink. And it was all about ways of gently distracting your customer from their demand for another whiskey, showing them a food menu and, chatting to them and keeping little notes behind the bar on exactly how much they've drunk. So I realized this all is part of the bartending.
I don't think those tactics would work here in Dublin. I'm not sure, particularly if there's no menu. But there's two little things, one big thing and one small thing. And it was very early on in the book. And it's the book, I think it's the little moment that really won me over in a way. She's in the tram. And I don't have memories of the tram. Most of the tram tracks were actually dug up, I think, around about the time I was born, until decades later, they decided it would be a great idea to have a tram service in Dublin. So it's back in all its glory. But the tram conductor, again, I do remember bus conductors very, very clearly, the men who collect. They were all men, except in the last few years there were women. They collected the fares off the individual passengers, But the way that the conductor on the tram was collecting the fare, he had a tin with carbolic at the bottom of the tin. Am I right? So you just dropped the coin into the tin. So there was no contact between the two hands.
Yeah. And it's, in fact, it would be disinfected by the time he picked up the coin. That was the theory of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant. The little detail was so, it was just that detail that made me feel I'm there, And I was wondering, do you recall, where did you find that?
I don't remember because, I researched so much. And in this case, I researched it worldwide too, because they were having to deal with exactly the same issues worldwide. So say they were masked far more in America than they did in Ireland. So or say the Argentinian government might have done posters, urging people to eat onions. So I stole little bits from everywhere. Right. But what I tried to capture overall was that feeling of confusion because, unlike us with our little diagrams of the coronavirus, they didn't know what they were dealing with. They didn't even know what a virus was. So there was a bewildering variety of bits of advice, and people would carry on with their lives very often, but with a vague sense of, the nearest cough might kill me, or they might keep garlic in their pocket, hoping that would ward it off. Yeah. So I would have done so much research and then just saved every little detail that I found most vivid, especially details of the senses. Like, for instance, the chapters are named after the colors that a patient would change to if he gets cyanosis, so a lack of oxygen in the tissue. So the chapters are called red, brown, blue, and black. And that's because it was almost like a sort of, color-coded alarm system of, increasing danger. That'd be an example of the kind of thing that I would snatch at as a way of making all this medical drama, more concrete, more kind of anchored to something sensory. Because otherwise, you've got a lot of statistics, and the last thing I wanted was any authorial voice saying, at this point, a certain 1,000 people had died. I didn't want any of that. So I needed the puddle of carbolic,
But that detail really won me over. And also the image, because the tram was packed and there were warnings about spitting and things like that. And one of the passengers spits on the ground, which really is something you don't see very often anymore. But I know when I was a young lad, it was something you saw all the time. It was very, very common. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about was that I think we tend to think that, the Irish state came into being in 1922. And that's when the industrial schools and the mother and baby homes and all that institutional cruelty started. And was that right up into the 1970s and 80s, was that kind of Stalinist levels, more people proportionately incarcerated in Ireland than in Russia when Stalin was plump. Yeah. And did you deliberately, or is it historical fact, or both, predate that bring that practice into 1918, 4 years before the foundation of the state, when we were still part of the British Empire?
It's perfectly factual. There were not as many of these institutions. So, for instance, if you look specifically at, I think, mother and baby homes, where a woman would go who was pregnant outside of marriage, and she'd be not exactly sentenced legally to stay there, but she'd be told by the nuns, you know, you have to stay a year to work off the cost of us letting you have your baby here. And if it's your second time around, you're what we call a repeat offender, and you have to stay 2 years to work it off. So that was not a legal sentence, but these homes did exist and did have these habits. And yes, so one of them, for instance, is from 1906. So you might have had more of them numerically in the 20s and 30s. And I don't know what the percentages incarcerated in these residential institutions were in the 1910s as opposed to later on. But no, they are absolutely not just a product of the Irish state. In a way, they're the Victorian welfare state. Some of them began as workhouses, say. So there was this sort of continuum of workhouses, orphanages, Magdalen hospitals for, you know, girls in trouble, reformatories. So some of them would be for teenagers who just didn't have parents, or who'd been taken away from their working class parents because they were maybe found loitering in the street. And some of them were for, you know, teenagers who more specifically got into trouble. So there are a very, very odd set of institutions, but no, they absolutely do predate the state. I think, you know, Victorian Britain found it very handy to have Catholic orders running these institutions. So institutions that would be funded by the government of the day and run by a Catholic order, they absolutely were a factor before then. And so even though we associate them so much with, you know, the nuns and the brothers and so on, they're not Catholic specific.
Yeah.
You know? And I find them a fascinating phenomenon because, say, in Canada, where I live these days, we think of them specifically as a racist thing. You know, it was white people locking up the indigenous people. But in Ireland, you see exactly the same dynamic, and it's not an ethnic difference. It's mostly a class difference. It was the middle class saying, "You dirty little urchins, get off the streets."
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, definitely. As ever, the poor endured it. And going back to, you know, and again, I didn't take out any of the books that I read when I was researching A Star Called Henry, but I knew obviously about the pandemic. I knew about the Spanish flu. I knew in a sense that it was such a huge global event, and I knew that a huge proportion of the population died as a result of it. But I remember when I was researching, you know, the resurgence of the Republican movement after they licked their wounds after 1916 and began to gather up again, and those who had been deported and sent to, you know, prisons in Britain, as they came back and began to reunite and reorganize. I don't remember one reference to the Spanish flu. And I'm just wondering, I can't. I'm sure there's somebody, an academic historian, who could tell me why this is the case. Was it just put aside by historians because they didn't think it was important?
And it's not just that in Ireland the the political, you know, changes overshadowed it, and because in other countries where they had no revolution, they still didn't talk much about the flu. It was just such a kind of painful personal loss in so many families. So many children were orphaned by it because it tended to kill people in their 20s and 30s. You know, so many children were then raised by grandparents or aunts and uncles, and it just seems to have been a terrible sword that they you know, tucked away, as with many shameful losses in Irish history. You know, and very little was said about it.
Yeah,
you know?
Because the famine, as we know, so there's so little written creatively about the famine. So few novels or stories at the time, and. Because I suppose it's a national shame. Yeah,
and I remember when I was researching The Wonder, which is set in 1859, but I remember a little anecdote about a town that was hit hard by the famine, and that some families just, as soon as they felt themselves getting ill, you know, from a combination of fever and hunger, they just shut the door, you know, not to be seen in their suffering. So the whole family would just tuck themselves away and die rather than reaching out for help. So I think I think the flu, it probably had a bit of that about it, you know, especially as, you know, as we're seeing now, the ones who are hit hardest by these pandemics are those who are weakened already by poverty and bad air. You know, whenever I read those, you know, government advice to, you know, seek out fresh air and sunshine, I would feel such a surge of rage, you know, as if people have the choice to find fresh air and sunshine when they're living in the Dublin slums, which were just the worst in Europe. You know,
yes.
So yeah, in a way, by setting the pull of the stars in an inner city hospital, I just, by definition, a lot of politics leaked in, because the the patients coming in are just so, worn out by having babies in a situation of malnutrition and bad water and bad air, that in a way the question of why they're ill becomes a very political one. It's not just a random virus,
Yeah. And we're running out of time now. I think there's going to be questions, but there's one other thing, the Angels plot in Glasnevin Cemetery. You don't name Glasnevin, but that's where I know it.
Yeah, there's a stillbirth in the novel, and the protocol of the day was you didn't talk to the mother about it at all. You boxed it up and wrapped it in brown paper and put it on a shelf, and then either the father would turn up the next day and he would bring the stillbirth off to Glasnevin, or else he mightn't come. Again, it was also miserable and mortifying, and the hospital might just wait, and then after a month they would put all of those in this Angels plot in Glasnevin. Yeah, I mean, Ireland at this point has so many mass graves that we've only become aware of recently. Various of the mother and baby homes, for instance, say in Tuam, now have these huge mass graves, and they're very haunting, aren't they? The idea that that a child dies and they're not even important enough to get a name.
Yeah. Well, I know the Angels plot well in Glasnevin. I have a brother, and I have a brother.
Oh. What age was he?
He had just been born. He was 2 years before me, right. 1956. And when years and years and years later, I asked my mother, would she like to know where he was? And she said she would. She'd never gone. She never saw him, and she'd never gone. And I found it was very easy to find. All I needed was his full name, which was the same as my name, believe it or not. And,
they reused the name.
Yeah.
No.
And his date of birth and death, and there was a grid, and we were able to go. And I saw her and my father standing at the point where he was buried. But that was hitting 60 years after it had occurred, the first time they'd gone, and there were a few headstones that had the names of children who were being reclaimed, if you like, by their family. Yeah.
I didn't know they had a grid. So you mean even if it looks like a mass grave, there might be a record somewhere?
Yeah.
I know that. My parents each had a little brother who died and was put on a headstone, but it's an absolutely normal part of Irish family history, isn't it?
So I went recently because my sister, I had organised that with my mother, and one of my sisters organised his name to be put on one of the headstones. And I went to look. And I spent ages looking. But in the gap, and it's not all that long between first going and then most recently going, there's a whole side of it now has headstones, and then it's onto the second side and around to the third. So people are reclaiming, but it goes right into the 1960s.
Yeah. God.
So on that cheerful note, but it's an extraordinary, Glasnevin is an extraordinary place to visit.
Yeah.
So much history.
Okay, I'm going to have a look at the ask a question box at the bottom here.
Are we able to do that? We are we? Do you want to take the questions then? They're going to be asked.
Sure. Here we go. Sheila Brown is asking me whether do I deliberately put my characters in claustrophobic or inescapable situations. Yes, and indeed you're right, Sheila Brown. I would say that Room is all about the inescapable bonds of parenthood. I remember my mother, she liked the 8 of us, no bother. But she did say to me once that whenever she went to the toilet in a public bathroom and she'd go in and shut the door, she would see our little hands coming under the door, unwilling to let her have a moment to herself even. So yes, but so even my books that are not about parenthood, I just find at a kind of a almost technical level, it's easier for me to create an intense and exciting dynamic between the characters if I limit their movements a bit, or I don't absolutely forbid something, but I make some good reason why they keep coming back to the same small space. Yes, especially recently. And Sheila Brown also says that The Woman Who Walked Into Doors is one of my favorite books. Me too, Roddy. In fact, whenever, the way nowadays people tend to emphasize how you need to have lived something to write it, which every novelist knows is complete rubbish. So Absolutely. When people are saying like, an authentic woman's voice is only going to be created by a woman, that book of yours, of all of yours, is the one that I kind of brandish at them and say, nothing inauthentic about this one. Roddy put in the work, whatever it took to get into the head of a battered woman, you did it, and it rings absolutely true. And I loved the fact you did a follow-up on her as well.
Nice.
Because, it's not every book where you want to find the character again years later, but that one, I think a lot of us had a craving to know how she was doing,
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, our next question. Kelly says, how and where did you do the research for the Pull of the Stars? So, I used modern medical websites and medical handbooks from the 1910s and quite specialist history books. And there are 2 big studies of the flu in Ireland, for instance. And I used studies of the flu elsewhere as well. There's a very good one called American Pandemic, for instance. And then what else would I have done? I also was lucky enough to have a copy editor who is an emergency room physician at the same time. She divides her week between the 2. So I knew she would, catch my worst medical errors. So that was a huge help.
Do you research as you write, or do you research?
I do a lot in advance, but then as I write, things arise. Like literally, one of the women in my book got kind of stuck, like the baby wasn't coming out, and then I was thinking, okay, what would they do next? And I looked into it in greater detail than I had before, and I found that in Ireland they had this very particular operation, symphysiotomy, where they would sort of unhinge the woman's pelvis to let the baby out. So suddenly I was off down this rabbit hole of controversy because, there are modern legal cases about this, and was it butchery or was it done for a good reason? So even though that operation doesn't actually make it into my story, I needed to understand enough about it, even to have half a page where the doctor says, oh, I think I'll snip her pelvis open, and the nurse is like, oh, let me try one thing first. So sometimes even the things that don't make it into our stories, we need to research. So Kelly says, would you have felt you could write this type of pandemic flu novel of 1918 in another setting or country? That's a very good question. I think I could have, because I've been to other times and places in my writing, so I could have indeed. I think I just felt really free in this case to set it where I liked, because I wasn't wedded to one particular real person.
And the dialogue, I mean, a lot of the phrases and the way they speak and the way you differentiate between the classes. So they're Dublin women, but there's one of them who isn't from Dublin, so to speak, originally. There's also a very middle-class woman, and there's different women, and you capture the different rhythms of that really, really well. So I suppose it was one thing you didn't have to research too.
Yeah, exactly. That bit didn't feel like work, Yeah. Well, one thing that's amazing in Roddy's novel Love is that his characters change how they speak as they get drunker. And I don't just mean like drunkenness as a kind of a verbal, error. I mean that they start to sound more like when they were younger, don't they, Roddy? You sort of understand their language.
The narrator lives in England, so he kind of, when he comes back to Ireland, he kind of reminds himself that this is where he came from. So as he gets drunk as well, he enjoys the shortcuts we take with the accent and the additional. We condense multisyllables into one, and then we also elongate monosyllables into multisyllable words. So we just mess with the whole language. And he enjoys that. He really likes re-owning it, and so that was a big. I wanted to do that. Was really painstaking, actually. It was just getting from their, if you like, middle-aged, lower middle class, perhaps middle class selves into the younger, more working class men or young men that they used to be, without announcing it. And hoping that I got away with it and didn't come across as just inconsistency. But
it strikes me as a beautifully painstaking novel because it looks so easy. It literally looks as if you just put a little recorder down on the pub, on the bar, but it's not that at all. I mean, the way it sort of segues between the past and the present, and moments in the conversation when they're being very real, and other moments when they're messing, or sparring. So it's
novelist, isn't it? That everything eventually becomes research. So, if you're ever feeling, if there's anybody there and they feel vaguely, judgmental when they see people in a bar doing nothing at all, don't write them off. They may well be me.
And I mean,
I'm doing my homework.
the bar is a crucial space in your work, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
Smile was mostly in a pub. Your 2 Pints series, which began on Facebook and then turned into books and has turned into a play. I mean, you're a bit obsessed with this locale, aren't you?
Not obsessed at all. You know, I haven't been in a pub since early March, the 6th of March to be exact. I miss the company. I don't miss the buildings as such, but I'd really like to get into one again. But I think it's where men of my age and my generation, it's where we meet. You know, we don't go to each other's houses. We weren't trained to do that, if that makes sense. You know, we got out of the houses as quick as we possibly could. And in a sense, although we have our own house, we never came back. It's the pub is where it's the space where you go and you talk nonsense.
And you don't even have to talk all the time. There's a lovely moment in Love where you describe, I hope I'm getting this right, you describe the pub as a shy man's heaven.
Yeah.
Well, I immediately thought of you, you know, because you're not as gabby as many writers are. And I could really see how the pub creates this lovely space where you can sip, you can listen to others, you can look at others. And there are lots of moments when they're staring at the girls, basically, and you can talk to the barman. You know, there's a kind of a lovely ritual to it where you don't have to be.
There's also that term ambient noise, which I always felt, you know, I like ambient music as a category. Sometimes Brian Eno, for example, I think wonderful. But with 2 friends and myself, we meet on a Thursday night now. We have a drink on Zoom. And I tell you, the gaps between the utterances are so loud and silent, excruciating. Whereas in a pub, you're rescued from all that. You know, if you're in good company, you don't have to say anything very often. It's more, and that ambient noise plays a vital role, really does.
Yeah. And often there's some other form of stimulus, like there'll be either a television with, you know, headlines going by or a bit of sport. There'll be something that you can all comment on as well. So it's a carefully shaped environment. Now, I'm not a pub person. I've never drunk alcohol, so I've never been that motivated to go to pubs. But I have to say, you know, that the best of the pubs you create in the book, George's, I have to say it felt blissful. You know, it was a beautifully described space where, you know, time kind of stopped, you know.
Yeah, I'm actually salivating now. I'd love a pint of Guinness.
I know what you mean.
Brian.
Okay, let's look at our other questions. Oh, Kathleen Donoghue, who I'm seeing must be a distant cousin of mine. She spells the Donoghue a different way, but basically the same family. She says that Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider about the flu pandemic wasn't published until 1939. Wow, I hadn't realized it was quite that long. And I'm wondering, William Maxwell's book about his mother dying of the flu, did that take a while too? Anyway, her question is, do either of you have any thoughts about when novelists will begin to write about COVID? Roddy, what do you think?
Well, I'm writing short stories. I was writing a novel when it started, and I kind of put it aside for a while because it's set in the present day, and I didn't know what that meant anymore.
Yeah.
For quite a while, and I think I'm getting the hang of it all right now. So I might go back to the book, but I decided to write short stories to capture the moment because, you know, it's only 4 months in a way. We were calculating, myself and my wife last night. It feels like an eternity, but it's actually only 4 months in a chunk. And yet each week has had its own feel, its own different anxiety. There was the kind of the giddy elation almost of the first few weeks, at least if you had a house that you could live in and you didn't have financial difficulties. And there was the adventure of adult children coming home and, you know, ludicrously extravagant meals, you know. My son used the one opportunity he had to go to the supermarket, but you could go to the supermarket once a day. There was one day he went for a bottle of vermouth, which was an ingredient for what he was cooking that day. Now that stops. And so I've been writing short stories to try and capture moments, people. In this, it's a form of insanity, I think, what's going on, really. So that's what I'm doing. What about you?
Yeah. I was writing something set in the distant past, and you know, for a while I thought, well, you know, it's good to get me away from now. But then the now started creeping in. So yeah, I'm writing something set right now too. I suspect there's going to be no time lag at all. Kathleen Donoghue, to answer your question, I think writers nowadays, they're not inclined to mull over something for 15 years before they consign their thoughts to the page. You know, I think in Italy they've been bringing out memoirs about the pandemic already. So yeah, I think there'll be no time lag at all. You know,
I suspect the first few will be a bit shite. I'd wait for the second. Like the pandemic, I'd wait for the second wave of novels about it. I think they might be more complete and a bit more impressive.
Yeah. Donna Raskin wants to know what is the name of the sequel to The Woman Who Walked Into Doors. It's Paula
Spencer.
Paula Spencer. Yeah.
Called that because I couldn't think of anything better.
Sometimes that's what works. I love the audacity of your title, by the way, for Love. You know, if it was a novelist I didn't know and he called his book Love, I'd be like, what? This one answers all the big questions, does it? You know, how dare you? But because it's you, I absolutely trust that you would have interesting and subtle things to say on the subject. So,
well, I thought I'd been around long enough to get away with a title like that because it's unexpected, I suppose. You know, and it is about love in its many forms. It's about the love of the men, the love the men feel towards the women that they've met in their lives, which is very deep. It's the love also that they probably would never articulate if they were sober for each other. And that's something that they're if in a way coming to grips with, they're reminding themselves about. And I think it's also in a way it's the love that Davy might just about towards the end of the book begin to feel for himself.
Yeah, and the fact that your men are, you know, getting a bit older, I mean, late 50s, somehow that brought out a sort of extra tenderness to it. I loved when one of them is having this weird sort of neurological thing. You've got this virtuoso passage where he keeps feeling like he wakes up over and over, like lots of mini slumps and revivals, and it turns out to be just exhaustion. But I thought that was such a stunning passage for capturing the way, you know, your brain might suddenly go wrong on you. And that makes you then think more needfully and more desperately about, you know, who in your life cares for you.
Yeah.
Indestructible.
Yeah. We reach a point where we stop using that phrase that's used all the time, the foreseeable future. There's no such thing.
That is so true. So true. And I realize we've used up our hour, Roddy, and we still don't know what the foreseeable future is, do we? Who knows what kind of world we'll speak again.
We managed to kill the hour fairly successfully, I think, you know.
And without pints even, you know?
Yeah, without anything. No, nobody actually offering us anything either. I think Melanie said that you have an opportunity to go and get water, but there was a time when people would have brought us water.
Let's see, did I skip any great questions now? Emma and Roddy, what are you currently reading? Okay, we're nearly out of time, so Roddy, you tell us something good you're reading.
Well, Hamnet is the best book other than your own I've read recently. And I'm reading a proof of Kevin Barry's new stories, which are coming out later in the year, and predictably enough, are brilliant. He's
a bugger that way, isn't he, Kevin? He's just more brilliant than the rest of us. Yeah, I second it about Hamnet. Yeah, Maggie O'Farrell's novel. When it got to me, I thought, oh no, this is one of these connected to Shakespeare kind of novels. It's trying to use Shakespeare as a hook, but not so. It just happens to be about Shakespeare's children, but you know, that doesn't matter. It's not about the celebrity factor at all. It's just a heartbreaker of a book. You know? And
come here, not only did we not get water, but I just got something flashed in front of me wanting a donation.
I know, you'd think we've done enough for them. You know?
Right. Thank you both so much. This is a great read to see. I marked all these pages here.
Oh, you're an attentive reader, Melanie. Thank you.
So that I could read passages to anybody who will listen to me. You have to read this. So please push the button right below the screen to purchase a copy from our bookstore, and use that link up in the chat to purchase a copy of Love. You will greatly enhance your quality of life during the pandemic by enjoying these wonderful novels. Thank you both so much. And thanks.
I really enjoyed that. Thanks, Melanie. And Emma, thanks. See you soon.